Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the summit stage. Many of you, I think, will have joined us last night for John Kerry talking about why the environment needs to be put to the top of the agenda. The former US Secretary of State was talking to the President of Ireland. Now we're going to look more at the nitty-gritty of this question, which is, will the pandemic help the Paris Agreement, and how are governments going to achieve carbon neutrality? COVID-19 has given an extraordinary chance to change things around a bit. Will it happen? Pratt is the founder of Future Planet, and he is going to be leading the discussion with some really good names. Carl, can I hand over to you?
Thank you so much, and welcome. It's lovely to meet you all today. Thank you for arriving. So it will be a pleasure to share this hour with our panelists. We have Bryony Worthington, co-director of the Climate Foundation, previously from Environmental Defence Fund Europe. We have Kate Wolfenden, a systems advisor from Project X. We have Dr. Ben Caldecott, director of Oxford Sustainable Finance, program and associate professor at University of Oxford. And we have Joe Wright, the CEO of Wright Plus. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So nice to have you with us. I thought I would talk a little bit about the structure for what we can expect to go through this afternoon, so that we all know how we'll move through the day. So we've intentionally curated or co-created probably about an hour of where we're going to share knowledge, perspectives, and experiences. This will be followed by a Q&A for us all to dive deeper into the theme. The structure will follow something like this. So it'll be introductions, there'll be a couple of polls in between, and then a Q&A at the end. So firstly, what I would love to do is to invite everyone to share a little bit about themselves. So if I could welcome you to share between 1 and 2 minutes for each question, as we've got about 6 questions for all of us, and that should help us keep through everything. We're going to go in an order in a circle each time. And so for the first one, if Bryony, you could share some opening remarks and a little bit of background, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure, Carl. Thank you. Great topic to be discussing, and not an easy one to answer in an hour. So I'm sure we'll probably raise more questions than we answer, but we can all hopefully share some interesting perspectives. My background is climate policy and campaigning. I've been working on this topic for probably 2 decades now. And in that time, I've had lots of different hats on. At the moment, I find myself in the philanthropic world, trying to devise grant-giving strategies to help make the Paris Agreement a success. So how do we get the next 10 years right is a challenge that we're currently working through. And I also have a policy making or legislative hat in that I have a seat in the House of Lords. So I spend some of my time overseeing legislation and regulations, and had a hand in the drafting of the Climate Change Act all those years ago in 2008. And I guess my opening comment, I think, is that climate change is just one of those issues that's going to be with us for certainly the remaining time of my life, and certainly my children are going to be experiencing the impacts throughout their lives. And it's not a quick fix. It's a multi-decade challenge. And we are going to see periods where climate change is the most important issue that's on everyone's mind. And there are going to be periods that, like at the moment, where other more pressing immediate matters take our attention and require us to directly respond. But it's a kind of underlying threat that is growing, and the risk is increasing with every year that goes by that we see greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere. So it's a really wicked political problem. It's long range. The impacts are being felt now, but the solutions will take time to deliver results. It needs the whole world to act together. There's the tragedy of the commons. So politically very difficult for anybody to make progress unless you feel everyone's coming with you. And we're not on a level playing field. We've got lots of headwinds. The incumbent industries are very keen on keeping things as they are and have been for the last few decades. But what we've seen over the last few weeks is that things are capable of shifting really fast. We all saw the announcements from BP laying off thousands of staff. Mm-hmm. The fossil fuel sector has taken a really big hit during this period, and it won't come back. There won't be a return to normal. It won't come back in the same way that it was before. So this is a moment of a sort of systemic shift potentially, and I'm looking forward to discussing all the opportunities that presents and the challenges that presents with the rest of these stuff of our team today.
Thank you so much. I really noticed, how do we keep on track whilst there's lots of other distractions that keep arriving? Already this year, we've noticed perhaps 2 or 3 that have arisen. Ben, would you like to share an introduction and a little bit of background as well, please?
Sure. Thanks, Carl, and it's great to be here this afternoon. So my day job is at the University of Oxford. I run a research centre there focused on how we can align finance with sustainability. I'm also seconded into the Cabinet Office, and I'm the COP26 strategy advisor for finance there, working to try and make sure that we have a really ambitious finance agenda for COP26, which is going to happen in November next year in Glasgow. I guess just a couple of reflections to kick things off. Achieving net zero globally by mid-century to tackle climate change is going to be really hard. It's not going to be a walk in the park. Every sector is going to have to get to zero emissions, apart from those that are really hard to abate. And there's some sectors of the global economy where reducing emissions to zero at the moment is almost impossible. For example, agriculture. And as a result of that, we're going to have to be able to capture and sequester lots of carbon to offset those emissions, those residual emissions from sectors that can't be abated. And that means we're going to need every sector, every part of society to mobilize to deliver this. That's going to require new technologies. That's going to need new market frameworks, new regulations, new incentives to get money to flow. And we're going to have to mobilize capital at a huge scale. A lot of the technologies, pretty much all the technologies that we're talking about, are more capital intensive than the ones they're replacing. So we're entering the most capital intensive period of human history. And that's a big challenge, as I keep saying. But we've got to use this crisis positively to try and address those big barriers and realize what we have to do to tackle climate change. So keen to interrogate how we can use the crisis positively.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. Yeah, I know. It's been big for all of us that COP26 has moved to next year, and perhaps this year it felt a little bit rushed for us to make the most of it. So I'd love to understand, as through the questions today, how we can prepare well for that moment as well, because it feels like, for me anyway, it's increased in significance because we have so much more time to prepare, but we also have the context of this last year to prepare within, because I think this is a very different world to the one where COP26 was happening and in. Thank you for your introductory remarks. Kate, would you like to, or Kate Wolfenden, sorry, would you like to share a little bit yourself?
Of course, and thank you for having me, and equally a pleasure to be here and to talk about quite a difficult subject. So a little background on me, Kate Wolfenden, a systems advisor based in London town. I work with multiple organisations, either as a non-exec director, an advisor, or a consultant. I specialise in the design and build of systems-led interventions, be they within industry decarbonisation, climate finance, or technology and innovation. And specific initiatives include Project X, which I co-founded, which span out of WWF, Transformational Capital Initiative, which is being built right now inside of Climate Kick, Sustainable Investment and Finance Corporation, which is inside Innovator Capital, and Tomorrow's Capitalism Initiative, which is inside Bolans. In terms of opening remarks, well, I would say sometimes in some bitter and twisted ways, life can throw you a bone, and there is no doubt that the global pandemic is one of a profound tragedy, but we are seeing hundreds of thousands of lives lost and more to come. But we're also setting precedents that we've never seen before in our lifetimes, be there from the finance angle, where we have 9 trillion and counting in fiscal stimulus packages being shaken down from the magic money tree, to global behavior change, where we're seeing a third of the global population, that's 3 billion, enter into lockdown overnight. So the message I really wanted to carry today is that wherever this pandemic came from, or wherever it chooses to take us, it is both our right and our responsibility to be able to harness and intelligently leverage those precedents, to be able to turn what is a tragedy into a means and a way to be able to achieve net zero by 2050. And I believe that we need to do so through smart and systems-led interventions that can lay on top of some of the industrial, financial and policy-led strategies that you will hear from my co-panelists today. And I look forward to sharing a few of those as we go along.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Jo Bamford, would you like to take the floor and introduce yourself, please?
Hello, my name is Jo Bamford. I'm a manufacturer, and I've been in manufacturing and engineering my whole life. My family make construction equipment, which I've done for 14 years. A few years ago, I decided to leave that and start my own green hydrogen business, making green hydrogen to deliver to end users. So we make green hydrogen through connecting a wind farm to an electrolysis kit. And then also we now have a hydrogen bus. So we've won contracts to supply hydrogen and the bus in London. We have over 100 of them on order in the UK this year. Really what I'd say about it is this. I stand ready with solutions. I have manufacturing businesses, and I also understand the infrastructure needs of heavy-duty vehicles. And for me, heavy-duty really needs to become, really works better with hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen. Well, for me, it's also a conversation which is, how do you decarbonize heavy-duty? And actually, in my view, it's quite simple. When it costs the same, when it does the same as your incumbent mode of transport, and is easy to fill up as your incumbent mode of transport. So what I can answer today is from that perspective. I suppose I'm a businessman who has a very green credentials. I also, on the other side of the family, my mother has been doing organic farming for 50 years, and we're probably the largest organic farming business in the UK too. So that's all about sustainability. That's all about restoring the soil. So I have two different very strong themes running through it. So I'm ready here to provide solutions.
Well, thank you. And also for sharing a little personal story. Feels really good to receive that. And I feel like so many of us are passionate about bringing our skills and our and whatever we may choose to do to this problem. I've really noticed how much passion has grown and how many people are now entering this movement. And more than ever, it's about how we quickly and effectively act on what counts and are really joined up, as Bryony was mentioning as well. So now we're going to move into slightly deeper exploration of how do we get the next 10 years right? And how would governments achieve carbon neutrality? And I'd like to welcome us, wherever possible, to be very tangible and specific, in a way measurable, and to perhaps hold in our minds what might be a short-term goal to get to a longer-term goal. I find it much more, much easier if we can have specific, measurable things that we can act on, and certainly, I guess, within the next 1, 2, 5 to 10 years as well. So maybe that could be a frame for how you would like to start, Kate, if that was okay.
Of course, thank you. And I'm not sure you're going to like my answers in that respect.
I think your answers will be really welcome, whatever you choose them to be, because you're very knowledgeable, so it'll be very good.
Thank you. Well, I have to admit, when joining this panel, I thought about it from a policy and from industry and a financial perspective. We were going to be able to hear quite a lot. I really wanted to bring something different. And that's why I've decided to focus on more of the humans and the systems viewpoint. So with that in mind, I probably got 3 ways that we could help, but in a little bit more of a left field approach to what you would expect. So of those 3 ways, the first one was to actually just quite simply start with our values. This can seem like an overly simplified approach, but actually, if we drive our strategies from a place of values, we can make great strides. I don't believe it's a coincidence right now that some of the more values-led countries are doing remarkably better. So Costa Rica and New Zealand as examples in comparison to, say, less now, but with thanks to initiatives like CDP, CDSB and TCFD, this is now storming ahead. And it is and in the process, it's setting forensically precise and powerful new legal precedents for failing to take climate action. And it's fast making climate denial or even slow climate action a fundamental breach of human rights. So if we were to do anything, we would invest heavily into that movement to enable it to accelerate all other movements. And then thirdly, I would experiment, but systemically. There isn't a silver bullet in this game. Let us not forget that the UNFCCC and the NDC within it, the nationally determined contributions mechanism within it, is a global diplomatic experiment in action, and the first critical success factor of which we've just had to delay by a year. We need to have multiple experiments, I think, and we need quite tight and transparent learning loops in the realms of policy, technology, financial instruments, and beyond to ensure our success. If nothing else, we can call them strategic options. And the only way I can relate to it is if you're about to jump out of a plane, would you do it not knowing that your parachute works? Or would you actually potentially have a few backups? So yeah, those are my 3 ways.
They're great answers. I love them. I really love the heart-centered values, but then also the very practical and applied ways. And particularly around, I agree with you around litigation. It's becoming a very effective tool. And if we can scale that up country by country, that becomes something that would yield a great amount of success. So thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
Ben, would you like to join us and share, perhaps in a similar kind of vein, some of your thoughts and ideas, please?
Sure, very happy to. And I agree with a lot of what was just said, particularly around kind of agile development, testing of different ideas and approaches, and the importance of climate litigation and liability. And you didn't mention one really significant NGO, I think, that's done more than the others, I have to say, for that, which is Client Earth. So just to give them a bit of a name check. But I wanted to sort of reflect on, I guess, a bit of a shorter term set of things and what we could do over the medium term. So obviously bailouts are at the forefront of people's mind at the moment. In the UK, there's this widely leaked, trailed project called Project Birch, which is what the Treasury is doing to try and figure out how industries and companies should be bailed out. And I think it's important that we think about conditionality in relation to those. And I think one innovation that's been gathering pace recently is this idea of sustainability-linked loans. So you can get a lower cost of capital if you meet, or you have to pay a higher cost of capital if you fail to meet. But it's linked to sustainability targets. So if you meet sustainability targets, you could pay a lower cost of capital, or you might be penalised depending on how it's structured. And I think integrating those into that kind of structure into the bailouts that are provided could be one way of incentivizing the right kind of behaviors from companies. I think as we move into the recovery and we talk about stimulus, I'm slightly less optimistic about the prospect of large stimulus being available, particularly in developed economies, particularly here in the UK. I think we'll be entering a phase of further fiscal pressure and constrained government balance sheets. So I think in that context, we need to think very carefully about how we price pollution and make polluters pay. And that can create the economic signals for some of the changes that we want to see in society. I think also we need to think very carefully about sort of smarter regulation and ways we can get the outcomes we want without necessarily there being public expenditure associated with it. I would say, though, that there's likely to be more government ownership in the economy for the foreseeable future. After the global financial crisis, or during it, we took a big stake in RBS, for example. We still own a big chunk of RBS as taxpayers, and I think you've got to plan for the long term. And it's quite likely that government will have minority or even majority stakes in assets like airports or airlines, and indeed other companies. And so how does government use that stake in those companies? And it's going to have to do that, linking back to the legal point. Actually, it's going to have to do that. Recent case law suggests it's going to have to do that in a way that is consistent with its own policy. And that means being consistent with the Climate Change Act and Net Zero, which Bryony helped to create. It means being consistent with other things like the 25-year environment plan, and a whole host of other things. So I think government kind of becoming more of an active owner, knowing how to be an active owner, a steward, and applying the right kind of pressure to the companies it's got a stake in. It will be its legal obligation, and UK government investments, which does that for government, will have to scale up pretty quickly. So those are just some ideas.
That's really helpful. And I noted, I believe this is correct, that Air France was one of the airlines that was leading in terms of their desire to build back better. And I wonder, it feels a little less joined up in the UK, but I am hopeful that perhaps it will become more joined up. When you talk about scale up or skill up, I think that would be interesting to see what that would need, what that would look like, what that practically would look like to have happen. Bryony, would you like to share a few thoughts and words yourself?
Yes, happy to. So some practical ideas. I mean, the Build Back Better narrative, I think, is a really strong one, but it's the degree to which it's going to be green or not will be determined by who's ready to pour concrete and build things. And there are going to be behavioural things that are lasting. I'm sure that'll be true. But we've seen that even with a huge global shutdown, individual consumer behaviour really doesn't dent the total sum of the greenhouse gas emissions. So we need systemic change. I think we've all said that, and we need to start seeing huge amounts of money pouring into solutions for clean energy. So I think what will be really interesting, if I were government, I'd be going to those companies who are currently not asking for bailouts, who have shown themselves to be resilient and who are capable of delivering at scale. And for me, that's the electricity companies. They've done an amazing task of keeping everything running, even with quite extraordinary circumstances of low demand and lots of variable renewables. And they are poised now to become the foremost energy providers into our economy by electrifying everything. So tangibly, we should be seeing huge amounts of investment in government procurement and government grants and government contracts, allowing that private sector investment into a massive upscaling of clean electricity and then electrification of transport, industrial processes and home heating. And I think that's all deliverable by the entities we have that have shown themselves to be resilient, well managed, positive balance sheets, and they'll all be adjusting in their own ways, but they're not cap in hand to government asking for huge bailouts, and therefore they are government's friends. I think the question Ben touched on around government finance and sort of taxing questions is going to be really interesting, because obviously Treasury is going to have to try and refill its coffers, and how will it do that in a politically sensitive way? And I think the chances of us seeing some sort of innovation levy that funds a green recovery on some sectors that are currently not paying any carbon price is I hope relatively high. I think a lot of it depends on just how deep this the economic impact is. And I know that the reason that government's pushed back its budget statement to the autumn is they just don't want to do anything now until they've lifted the rock and looked underneath to see exactly how much damage has been done to the economy, and they don't want to make any early pronouncements. So things like aviation, we just don't know how deep and severe the fall is at the moment. I could see it coming back. You could just imagine a Grant Shapps-led investment in electrified short-haul flights, because I think the trend is going to be towards smaller aircraft, shorter distances, and we've already put an investment of over 300 million into R&D in the UK on electrification of short-haul flights. I can just see that emerging as a new stimulus package out of the wreckage of the industry, but a lot of it depends on how much is still able to be resurrected. So it's still early days, I think, but we'll see government wrestling with this political challenge of knowing that they need to raise money, but also knowing that they can't politically alienate voting people who will reject an addition of taxes at this time. So where will they go? They'll have to find ways of, as you said, Ben, getting the polluters to pay, but it'll be an interesting dance, and I suspect we might all want carbon prices up in the 10s, 30 euros, whatever. I suspect low-level levies that gather money together and then redeploy that money into innovation grants or contracts for difference that actually get things built. I think that's what they're going to want to see, building out of clean infrastructure. And I think anyone who's got a shovel-ready project that they want to get built, now's the time to be submitting that into the various policy making fora.
Yeah, I agree. And that these are all really good solutions. Without being too challenging, and they're great solutions. It feels like our level of ambition needs to be 100x more if we're looking at a 10-year time frame. And all of the things that I'm hearing right now feel like they take a while to get people to decide about, to embed. You know, like I think that's the challenge that we face. How can we rapidly mobilize cash? And one of the things that I've really noticed about what COVID did, and it's what I feel like we've somewhat not managed to achieve with the climate change movement, is this sense of immediacy and this sense of tactical immediacy. It happens in pockets, but I haven't noticed it happening with this kind of groundswell of like, no, we need to throw a lot of money at that problem. And I think if we were to join up that with your notion, Kate, in terms of experimenting, and a lot of what you were both showing, Ben and Bryony, then we're starting to get at something that might even be close, you know, to getting to the level of appetite that we need to really get this done. You know, I feel like it's like we, you know, this is a World War type effort, right? This is a like Dunkirk type moment, and none of these solutions are Dunkirk in their immediacy. And I think that's the key challenge that I have for all of us. It's like, how do we make that happen? Yeah, anyway, sorry. No, not sorry. That's what I really believe. Joe, would you like to share?
Well, it's very interesting listening to everyone on the panel. And look, we've heard a lot about climate change, and we've heard a lot about, you know, the problem of climate change, etc., etc. But actually, we don't hear a lot about solutions. And really, that's where I'm sitting at the moment. My view is we've got to provide solutions. Solutions that think about customers, think about, you know, how do I replicate what we do today? Because fundamentally, one of the most difficult things to change is human behavior. And, you know, when I look at zero emissions around transport, my view is simple. You know, I don't want to change our behavior and how it works and what we do. And so, you know, I think filling up a car in 5 minutes, well, you can do that with hydrogen. I think, you know, we can already, I know I can already deliver hydrogen for the same cost as running diesel on buses in the UK. So I think that's a great solution going forward with this. But I think over the next 10 years, we just have to we have to try some of these things. We have to look at some of these things, but not get wedded to one singular solution. You know, electrification is good on some things, but I think you're going to end up waking up in about 5 or 6 years' time and finding that electricity becomes very expensive when you have to triple the grid. And it doesn't really work on big and heavy. So let me put it in context. If you want to have Boeing 747 running on batteries, you'd need 2,700 tons of batteries to get it off the ground, i.e. it would never get off the ground. So my contention for Britain is simple. You know, we don't make batteries in Britain. We don't have any solutions around that, but I think we have a lot of wind and we have a lot of water, and we're ready to go. I have shovel-ready projects. I've already got planning permission to connect an electrolyzer to a wind farm. I'm very hopeful that the future is going to be good, but I think you need to enhance everyone in industry and help them drive their businesses towards zero emissions, because most people are very pro it. Everyone is trying to get find solutions. We've just got to help people towards those solutions. I don't think anyone today is sitting there going, "Oh, you know, what about climate change?" I mean, there are people, but most businesses today are pushing on zero emissions and how do I make this work? And I don't think you should change, you know, the economy or change the way everything works. I think you should enhance everyone to try and find a solution, and not create an us and them situation. I think we all ought to go in the same direction and provide solutions. So today, you know, in my world, I'm ready. I have a bus business. I have a green hydrogen business. We have electric buses, so then on batteries. We have hydrogen electric buses on full zero emissions. And I think the world will move very quickly towards that direction. And I think as we come out of this, you know, very easily, I can provide you a plan to, over the next 10 years, if the UK government wanted to make all 40,000 buses in the UK zero emissions, we can do that very quickly. The only thing about you have to do is is think about how, the planning and the infrastructure. The infrastructure is the longest lead time on anything. It takes about 2 years to get planning and put everything in place, put the charging stations or the filling stations, make the hydrogen production facility. And after 2 years, you can just do it depot by depot across the UK. So that's a solution that we can work in the world that I understand and know. And that's what I'm trying to provide.
Thank you for sharing that practical solution. It's really helpful and very tangible to receive that. Thank you. So we're doing great for time, but also we are not doing great for time. So what I will do is I'm going to conflate 2 questions together. So but also before we do that, I'd like to welcome the audience to participate in a poll which we have running at the moment. And the question is very simple. Will we get the next 10 years right? Very simple, yes or no. And it would be interesting to get a sense of what people are thinking. There may be another poll live as well, which connects to the next question. So if you're in the poll answering mood and you want to answer them both at once, then the second one is, will the pandemic help the Paris Accord? With a simple yes or no associated with that as well. And that leads us on to the next question, and that's how can this pandemic help the Paris Accord? What have we noticed that's happening around us? What elements of this pandemic have we seen rise up? And I guess to conflate that with another part of the question, what blockers are there to more countries joining up, and how do we overcome them? So how does the pandemic help the Paris Accord? What blockers are there, and how to countries signing up, and how do we overcome them? And that question to start with Ben, please.
Sure. So, how can the pandemic help the Paris Agreement? I think the first thing, and we've sort of touched on this already, is the fact that social norms have changed incredibly quickly in the space of 3 months. We're doing this. We're on endless video conference calls. I very rarely would do video conference calls, I must admit, and hated the idea. And now, it's part of daily life. So that's going to, of course, have massive implications for how we work and our cities and well-being and all the rest of it, right? So rapid change is possible, and we're demonstrating that. I think the other thing is that this accelerates structural change in the economy and in sectors. So sectors that were finding it hard anyway because of the transition have been finding it even harder. The coal industry, for example, and that's a good thing for climate change. So incumbents are under more pressure. I think I've talked about the bailouts, the stimulus. There's a way in which that can help. I think the runway for COP26, because obviously it was going to be in November this year, we've now got 18 months between now and November 2021. That allows us to build momentum to around a whole range of different things that I don't think was going to be possible before, just because of timing. And there's also an opportunity now that I think we were missing, potentially at risk of missing, of connecting the climate agenda with the nature agenda. And obviously COVID, zoonotic disease, and we have this other big international summit next year in China for the conventional biological diversity. In some ways, that's an even bigger deal than COP26, because you're creating a new set of targets and a new framework for nature over the next decade and beyond. So we can connect those things together. That's an opportunity. But I think it's very easy to be maybe too optimistic sometimes. I think, we've got to realize that, well, I don't think this is going to be a neat V-shaped recovery. I'm not sure who does anymore. I think we're storing up all sorts of issues. I think the productive capacity of the economy will be significantly affected. I think there's some trends within geopolitics that have been accelerated that are not going to be particularly positive, that open up potential future conflicts and trade wars and all sorts of things that could really undermine our ability to do any global cooperation on anything in the future. So, it's not. It might have opened up a Pandora's box in that sense as well. So, but I think there are these positives that we should obviously be more focused on.
Thank you for sharing. Bryony, would you like to share some thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I think probably the the biggest help has been to move the COP out of the spotlight of the US presidential elections. If you recall, we were going to be going into the COP just days after the election, and so we would have had either another Trump administration or a new US administration, and they wouldn't have had any time to process or come to any conclusions. So by giving ourselves a lot of clear water between that process and the COP process, there's a slim chance that we might see the US back in an engaged capacity. And let's not forget, the only reason we have the Paris Agreement is because the US decided to take a proactive approach to negotiating that treaty and involve China and Europe in that process. So that the geopolitics of COP next year could be a lot better. I think obviously we've got, there is still the chance that we see another Trump administration, but at least we'll know about it in advance and we won't be having to deal with it in real time. And it gives I think, Europe a chance to get its Green New Deal cemented into legislation, which is hugely important. I don't think we should underestimate the fact that Europe is about to commit to net zero in legislation, which is, that's the world's biggest consumer market saying it's going to go zero. And I think that's phenomenal. So it's just working its way through the legislative process now. Once that emerges, that's going to trigger a whole ton of new policies and investments. So it gives Europe time, it gets us out from under the US. And I think the really unknown is where does China land on its stimulus recovery, and it's obviously abandoned its GDP targets, but it's still going to be tempted to do its usual fairly old-fashioned build out its industrial infrastructure way of recovering its economy. And if it is going to plan to build new coal infrastructure to add to the existing 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power stations that exist today, that's a massive decision point. So I think from our perspective as grant givers, we're hugely interested in what can be done about coal in China, and it's not an easy answer when you're sitting here in London. But I think that's the we've got, as Ben said, a little bit more time to do the diplomacy, to work out what the pathway is going to be to the COP, and to hopefully have a COP where there are some real tangible commitments to increasing ambition, because let's not forget that the existing Paris commitments to take us to a 3-degree world, most likely, and so we've got to have that ratcheting up of ambition. So we need those big 3 blocks to demonstrate they're serious, and then every other country also to play its part and put pressure on those 3 big players.
I agree. I think what's been really encouraging is the amount of signatories and pledges that we've seen. It's been very exciting, actually. But I'm very acutely aware of the challenges that will then face towards getting action to happen very quickly, because actually on the ground or within organizations, a lot needs to happen to get those pledges to be met. So it'll be interesting to notice the shift of, I'm certainly noticing within the sustainability sector, a lot more jobs are becoming available and people are tooling up or skilling up. But I would imagine that's going to shift quite a lot over the next 6 months as well, 8 months, as people realize what they need to do to get this job done. So we've had the poll results in. Before I go to you, Joe, and then Kate, I just want to mention the poll results. So will we get the next 10 years right? It's quite close, actually. In fact, a little bit more optimistic than we might have thought. So 56% of people say yes, and 44% said no. So if we were in America right now, we would have had a president. So I think that feels fairly good. Although maybe by the end of this, hopefully we'll have slightly higher on the yeses. That'd be really nice. I feel really optimistic about that, actually. I can do 56% because I can make that 60, then I can make it 70, and then suddenly we're almost there. Joe, would you like to share a little bit about how the pandemic can help the Paris Accord, please, and what you may be noticing are some of the blockers that you've seen, and how can we overcome them?
So I think the most interesting thing about all of this at this point in time, we have had a period, a pause, as it were, on the world. And, the sky has been wonderfully blue and we haven't had pollution. And I think that's one of the most positive messages that have come out of this. And governments and politicians have noticed that. Now, the flip side is slightly true, and this is a concern, which is, diesel in the world of transport is cheap, and there could be the opportunity to slide back into buying cheap stuff and getting it going forward. However, You know, I'm sitting on here with a bunch of people trying to use whatever voice I can, and I think people need to use whatever voices they can to call on government to push for change, and also at the same time push for solutions. You know, again, I can provide a hydrogen bus. It's a bit more expensive than a diesel bus, but the hydrogen costs the same as running that bus on diesel, and we can do that today. If you give me a bit of volume, I can get the bus to cost the same as a diesel bus. So, you know, it's not actually beyond the wit of man to get mass adoption and change. And I think that's quite a great solution. Let's keep it in our country as well. You know, we have lots of wind, we have lots of water. Let's turn that into energy. As to COP26, I think that would be great to show what we can do in our country here. 73% of all the batteries in the world come from China. Okay, we don't hugely make them in huge volume. That is one solution. But if I'm going to be a betting man and go somewhere as a businessman, for me, Britain should be pushing really heavily on hydrogen, which works on the big and heavy stuff. Okay, you know, every other economy in the world is chasing zero emissions at this point in time. As a businessman, you go somewhere where you can compete and come out on top, where there's less competition. You know, if someone's got 73% market share of the world, it's very difficult to move that down. I like China immensely. I spend a lot of time going to China, but it's quite difficult to shift that. So I think coming out of this, I'm very positive that we can get there. But, you know, you're going to have to enhance all of society to drive in the same direction and try and find solutions.
I think that's interesting, and I hear you. I also noticed the shortening of supply chains. I think that's going to be something that we'll have to grapple with, and like the challenge around how quickly the system pushes back into the supply chain as well. You know, and whether we can solve that big challenge, for example, around Scope 3 carbon in supply chains, and use this moment as that opportunity, and also inclusivity as well. And I think, you know, when you talk about made in Britain, what I hear is shorter supply chains. I don't think everything needs to be necessarily made in Britain. I think every country has got great exports and great things, but I definitely hear less carbon, shorter supply chains. Kate, would you like to share something?
Of course. Right, so taking another sort of slightly left field approach in this one, I would say that the pandemic can help and hinder in many ways. I just really wanted to pick up on one thread, and that is that the climate finance movement has been long calling to integrate climate finance into broader societal spend in such things like infrastructure in order to mainstream it for many, many years now. And through this terrible global tragedy, we now have this opportunity. But it very much is a unique and time-bound opportunity. And of this, we need to be crystal clear. I don't think there will be another moment in our lifetimes when we can mobilize the scale of money we have done now. So in the words of Selwyn, the Assistant Secretary General of Climate Action at the UNFCCC, who said earlier this week, this is our only chance to be able to do it. And this window of opportunity is now, and the subsequent stimulus packages to get us out of this. The why I don't think it can happen again in future is because genuinely global debt couldn't handle it. We'll be paying off this one for the next 30 to 35 years, which is way beyond when we need to be able to reach net zero. So this window of opportunity matters, but it's what we do with it that counts. And on that, the jury is still out. So we have some really good examples of how the pandemic can help. And as Bryony already mentioned, with the EU, where we've seen great progress of the climate emergency and the Build Back coming together. Just last week, they published the multi-finance framework, which is basically the proposed budget for the EC from 2021 to 2027, detailing 1.85 trillion worth of spend over that period of time, and allocating 25% of that spend to climate action, both in the standard budget but also recovery. That's got to go to member states, but that's an amazing step forward. But if you pair that up with other examples, also mentioned China, but a prime example that really struck a chord with me was South Korea, whose ruling party came to the election with a strong Green New Deal proposition, but literally months into the crisis, it's been seen to bail out the biggest coal building plant in the region to the tune of 1 trillion won, which is about 825 million. But yeah, so just touching briefly on the overcoming of barriers, I just wanted to touch upon the role of consumers and citizens, actually, because wow, what an amazing 3 months we've just had. I mean, if we look back to last year, I think we're starting to realize how powerful we can be with Extinction Rebellion and the various different movements around us. At the end of the summer, we had a UK net zero law. Right now, with the George Floyd protests, we're seeing the dismantling of the Minneapolis police. And in lockdown, we've seen the collapse of the economy because we stopped spending. I think the big message here is that we as citizens and consumers are very powerful. We just didn't know it. And we can vote every day, and we can help overcome these barriers every day by choosing our pensions, choosing our products, choosing when to protest, where to put our savings, who has our mortgages, where are our insurance products, and even our choice of employer. And I think we all need to take a collective responsibility for that, and especially in these really critical years.
I hear you, and I definitely agree. And I think for me, it's the beautiful marriage between, and we'll see this evolve, I hope, as the year goes on, but the connection between people that are creating change within organizations and the communities and consumers that they serve as well, and how they can together co-create better products and services that allow them to live in that carbon-free world. And we're certainly seeing a lot of exciting new innovations, and my hope now is we see a lot more transformational change from larger businesses as they serve customers in a more effective way and in a low carbon way. And I think some of those partnerships are starting to flourish now, is what I've seen. So we have now some questions. We have 15 minutes left of this particular session. So we've had some questions from the audience. We also had a poll result in from, will the pandemic help the Paris Accord? And perhaps as a response to my call for enthusiasm, or perhaps just because that's the way we all feel that it is, will the pandemic help the Paris Accord? 80% said yes, and 20% said no. So that feels, I think maybe we can start to feel much more optimistic towards the end of this call. We now have about 5 questions. I feel like I might nominate someone to answer a question from the audience, but if you choose that that's not for you, you're welcome to challenge me and pass it to someone else. So the first one is, what do we do about America and Trump? And I feel like, Kate, you have a beautiful answer on leadership, and we've talked at some length around this. And my view, and I'd love you, perhaps you could connect to this, but if I would just start with the direction of flow on this, is that Trump matters less than perhaps we allow him to matter. And certainly one of the things that we've seen is a growing movement of people that now can create change. My sense is how we then mobilize and act together. But you had some wonderful words on leadership, and perhaps also challenged me recently about this, on how we need to act against him. Would you like to share something about that as well, Kate?
Of course, yeah. And I remember us having this discussion, because a lot of people say Trump doesn't matter, but the rate at which he's rolling back important environmental policies is in such a critical time window is near catastrophic. And so I think we all have a right and responsibility to speak up about him, and I think we should all use our voice to do so. In the context of leadership, I think a lot of people have been talking about how we need a set of visionary leaders, or a leader or a single leader to be able to guide us through this. And actually, I'm going to go back to the people point of view as well. That I think a really good piece of work that came out of global optimism a few years back now was the Profiles of Paris, and what it covered was about 100 plus faces of the people that made such a monumental moment in history, like the Paris Climate Accord, happen. But actually, it was really scratching the surface of who actually made that happen with blood, sweat, and tears over the course of the years. So I think in relation to Trump, I think the act in spite of movement is the one to focus on. One of the positive benefits out of Trump coming into power was there was such a positive movement with the Climate Action Summit last year, as an example. We hope upon hope that he will not get into power again, and it would be catastrophic if he did. But in the meantime, it's the power of cities, the power of industry, the power of investors and the power of philanthropists that are rising up against him is what we need to get behind.
Yes, thank you. That's what I was hoping that you would share. And the power of many of us, for example, everyone on this call, everyone that we know, and beyond that as well. Bryony, I was wondering whether you might like to share some thoughts around this. And I think the question's written. Let me see. So do you think people will seriously think about not flying once this pandemic subsides? And will business go back to life before lockdown and forget about the climate benefits? So I guess something around, will we be able to stop the system moving back into place as it was before?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, there's definitely going to be a certain portion of people who will just be waiting to jump on a flight again and resume their normal life. I mean, the long-term trends of aviation demand in the UK for business travel are already declining, and I think it will decline even further, partly because of things like this, where people are realising you can have really productive conversations and conferences without having to jump on a flight and spend 18 hours in customs. So I think a lot of this behaviour will be quite sticky. I suspect though it will, normality will return to some degree, and the challenge is to, as people have said, attach some conditionality to the bailouts that are granted to this sector. There's the ongoing risk that this pandemic doesn't really ever finish. We may not get a vaccine. It might become something that we live with. And we may find out more about how the contagion and how it spreads, and people's nervousness will continue, and therefore risks will be reduced, and people's desire to take a risk will be reduced, and we'll be holidaying and shortening supply chains, holidaying closer to home. That could be an outcome. I think it's just a bit too early to say, unfortunately, because new information is coming out about the virus almost all the time as we get to know it and understand it. The reality is that we've got to find ways of moving around the planet which don't add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And I completely agree with Joe when he says we've got to invest in infrastructure now that gives us those options in the future. So anyone who's got shovel-ready R&D deployment projects that can create jobs in the UK right now, they should be getting in to talk to the Chancellor in number 10, because the chances are the government will be trying to make that happen. So I think there will be a return to something closer to normal. It won't be exactly as it was before the pandemic, but we shouldn't really be counting on any of that. We should be making the systemic investments now that gives us the option in the future to do the things we used to do, but without the greenhouse gases associated. That seems to be the most sensible route.
Yeah, I feel that's definitely the case. It definitely resonates, and with regards to flying. Short of just not flying, and as we're all experiencing, video conferencing allows us to win back quite a lot of life, which is quite useful. What if we were to fly? What percentage of the way there would fuel get cleaner fuels get us, and how difficult is that to implement in a world where perhaps fuels are cheaper now, for example? Bryony, is that something that's within your knowledge frame?
I think flying is difficult because physics is against you. I think if we look at shipping, I say to Joe, where I see hydrogen coming into the UK at scale is in shipping, because just seen the Isle of Wight announcement that because we've got this abundance of renewable electricity now, we've got these lifeline ferries that can be invested in by government to start bringing in this innovation. I think you'll see fuel cells and hydrogen being used in those services for those big vessels that really need a new fuel, a sort of molecular form of energy. And as Joe said, there's this wonderful superabundance now of clean electricity at certain times of the day and month and season. And if you're being paid to take that power, which is what's happening right now, I'm getting paid when there's low demand to actually do my washing at a certain period. So it won't take long before entrepreneurs realize that's a feed into their industrial process, and they can start making hydrogen from it. So all of these things will come. Now, how that translates into aviation is a little bit more complex, because Joe would know better than I, but the synthetic fuels you need to get an aircraft born and then up into this is it's a different challenge than just replacing land-based engines. So who knows? I think there'll be a lot of experimentation and a lot of synthetic fuels will emerge. We can use some biofuels, but I wouldn't want to be betting on biofuels because of their land take. And so some form of synthetic fuel is going to be, I'm sure, what emerges.
Thank you for sharing. we're galloping into the last, which is exciting. Ben, would you like to share a little bit about, so this is the question for you. How would coordination be achieved between different countries necessary to tackle climate change, especially considering the large gaps that are present? And I'm assuming with those large gaps, it means in varieties of where they are in terms of their actions.
Right, so that's a big question. That's basically, how does the international community respond to climate change is the question. And, great. Well, I'm not going to try and answer all of it, but I will, I guess, say two things. One is that it's really important that we get, as Bryony was saying, we need to ratchet commitments that countries have made. And they're currently not at all aligned with what was agreed in the Paris Agreement, well below 2 degrees. So that's the first thing. The reason Paris exists is partly because of this recognition that a UN top-down international agreement was never going to be possible. The UN could never enforce that kind of agreement, and you're reliant on countries voluntarily doing things. You're also reliant on non-state actors, companies, financial institutions, regions, cities doing things and innovating and making commitments. And so we've got to make it the norm that you have these net zero commitments, and they need to be coming up, percolating bottom up, and you need ways of building trust and making sure that people don't break promises and that people are encouraged to be more ambitious over time. And so that dynamic and getting that dynamic going is a large part of the aspiration of the Paris Agreement. I think one part of that is around transparency and making sure that you can see when companies are breaking their promises, and see how far we've got to go and what else needs to happen. And I think transparency, ultra transparency enabled by new technology is one way that we can realize that. And that's a key bit of what we need for that positive dynamic to really succeed.
Thank you for sharing. It feels like that topic was a whole session in itself, which is nice. So, Joe, I'm just going to frame this because we only have 3 minutes left. So just to be mindful of that, I will probably need at least 30 seconds to say people's names and say thank you. But so the question for you is, with the millions of homes to be made all electric and the tripling of grid capacity for electric vehicle charging, isn't it about time we trained hundreds of engineers? Feels a simple answer.
It is a simple answer, and we should train lots of engineers, but we shouldn't train them on batteries because, look, at the very beginning of January, I went to go and see lots of battery manufacturers in China. I saw the 5th largest one there. They have 80,000 people just researching battery technology. Now, in Britain, we chuck out 10,000 engineers a year. So just in the 5th largest one, they had 8 years capacity from the UK's engineering. So what we are trying to do is set up a hydrogen hub in association with Queen's University of Belfast, one of the largest and best engineering universities in Britain, to train them to do an area that we could be specialists in the UK. And so therefore, we are driving those jobs. We also, in my family, run our own high school. We have 600 pupils. They're taught proper skills on a daily basis. We run it in conjunction with Rolls-Royce and Toyota. And we have 1,000 people doing apprenticeships with us and getting degrees. So we do a lot of training of engineers as a family and as a business. So and I think we should be very positive about the future. The future can be very green, and we need to find solutions and come together and drive that. So I'm excited by the future, and I'm excited about it being green. And I think we've got some fantastic people in Britain that can take us along that way.
Thank you very much for sharing, and your excitement is enthusiastic as well for me. I feel like we could all have commented on different questions at different times and probably have much more that we would like to share. But all that remains time for me to do is to thank everyone here. Bryony, thank you. Kate, thank you. Ben, thank you. And Joe, thank you. And thank you for everyone who joined us this afternoon for, I think, a wildly optimistic, if not somewhat pragmatic approach to what we might do to tackle the challenges we have over the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.